Make that big boss less special. It ain't no game, but they saying welcome to the second level. Second level.
Hey everybody, thanks for coming on out. Up next we have Kevin Snow, who's going to be presenting his talk, Game Accessibility, 4 Key Features. Kevin, take it away.
So hey everyone, I'm Kevin Snow, as you just learned. And I'm a writer and narrative designer for video games. And some of the ones I've worked on include Where the Water Tastes Like Wine, which is out there, thank you, which is out there on the show floor, you can play it. I'm also one of the writers on Battle Cakes, which is also out there on the floor. But aside from writing for video games, I also direct independent game projects where I'm usually the sole designer and handle a lot of the production of the project, which is where accessibility comes in, because these are things that I need to be thinking about while I'm designing games. And before I go any further, I'm going to define accessibility, because this word means a lot of different things in game spaces. Usually, when people use it, they're referring to like game difficulty, like how difficult is Dark Souls, for example. And although difficulty can be an aspect of accessibility, it's not specifically what I'm referring to in this talk. What I'm referring to is design, specifically game design, that includes people with disabilities. And that's really broad. So how I'm going to break that down is I'm going to talk about 4 basic features of accessibility. And when I say basic, a lot of games still don't really have these, because this field is kind of only really gaining traction in the last few years as studios kind of start implementing policies on how to handle these features. So this is very much something that's still like a discussion. All of this are, basically all of these are still open questions. But what I'm going to cover is subtitles and what makes a good subtitle, colorblind modes and what that might look like depending on what type of game you have, UI, user interface, and text customization options, and also button and control customization. So with subtitles, this refers to, of course, the caption for voiced content. And there's actually standards for these that you can refer to from television and film industries that are really handy. An excellent thing to do is to indicate the speaker in subtitles. For example, if it's a character speaking, you have their name before the text is displayed. There's also having captions for significant sounds. For example, if there's important information in your game that's only being communicated through sound rather than visually, for example, captions are really good. And another important thing with subtitles is having a legible font that's easy to read. Like, stylized fonts aren't really a good idea with subtitles because they can be hard for certain people to read at a glance. And also having, it's best if you can have options to resize the subtitles, but if you don't have that in there, it's better for the default size to kind of be a larger size. And I don't usually like using negative examples, but with subtitles, using a negative example in this case is really easy to understand at a glance when a subtitle doesn't work. For example, with this game, there's no option to resize the size of the subtitles, and they're super, super tiny, which, in this case, one thing they did do right is it does indicate the speaker in these subtitles, but otherwise it's really tiny and there's no customization options with it. The next thing I'm going to talk about is colorblind. And this is probably the trickiest one I'm going to talk about because this looks really different depending on what your game actually is. Kind of the best practice with colorblind modes is to try to avoid communicating essential information for gameplay only by fixed color. And when I say fixed color, I'm referring to color you can't change, essentially. Because a way of kind of solving this issue for folks who have color blindness is allowing them to change the color of something that's important in the gameplay. For example, like the team colors. There's also preset modes and filters Individual customization is a little bit stronger, but presets are, of course, a better step than not having them at all. And there's many types of color blindness, but 3 of the most common ones, there's 2 types of red-green color blindness that are a little bit different, and then there's yellow-blue color blindness. One tricky thing with this is many players actually don't know what type of colorblind they are. Actually, if you search on the internet, there's a lot of articles from players who didn't realize they were colorblind until they got really frustrated playing a video game and like went online to forums and talked to other players about it and realized, oh, there's actually information that the game is providing that I'm not getting because like these 2 colors look the same to me. So kind of how some games have handled this. Well, it's missing an image there, that's okay. On the right here, we have FTL, faster than light. You can see on the left-hand side that it has a red gradient that indicates a damaged part of your ship. Whereas on the right, if you turn on colorblind mode, it adds a pattern so that even if that color looks similar to other colors or looks muted, you can still sense out the pattern. And another thing that mode does, if you look at the aura around the enemy characters, you can see that it increases the contrast between the enemy characters in the background. So with user interface and text customization, this is also really difficult. Kind of like subtitles, it's best if you can have options to kind of change the size of individual windows in your user interface or to resize text. But if not, it's better to go with defaults where they're essentially larger. Like for example, I grew up playing PC games, and with a lot of PC games, especially like RPGs, they kind of expect you to be hunched over your monitor. So all the text in the user windows are really super tiny, which is kind of presents a problem for a lot of low vision players. Another thing to consider with user interface and text customization is having a high contrast between the user interface and the background, because if those 2 things are kind of conflicting, it makes it really difficult to parse the information that you need. And this is a game, The Swords of Ditto. Something I really liked about it when I was playing it is in the options, there actually are options to resize the size of all the user interface windows in the game. And you can see that with this game, that's particularly easy because the design of that window, for example, is really simple. It's kind of like, it's a stylized box. So where the design comes in is that most likely they were thinking about being able to resize the windows when they designed the design of the user interface. Because it's really difficult to actually go back and kind of redesign something that already has like a really intricate kind of preset design to be able to be stylized that way. And with button and control customization, this one is another thing where it's kind of a spectrum. Like having a couple of controller presets is good, but if you can have individual button remapping, that's even better. Because one thing you really can't anticipate is how people are actually going to customize your controls, especially if they're like limb diverse or have some kind of condition that makes it difficult to use certain like common control configurations that the majority of players use. With button and control customization, another important thing to consider is that if you can provide alternatives to complex control schemes, like for example, motion controls or button mashing or something that has some kind of stressful physical demand, that can open up your game to a lot more players as well. And some examples here. Here's Overwatch, where you can actually, Overwatch is a shooter where you can play like a lot of different characters, and it actually allows you to set the control scheme for each individual character, which is a pretty, and it's also individual button remapping rather than presets. So that's a pretty significant amount of customization. Yep. And another game I like, In the Long Dark, there's an accessible interaction option. In the Long Dark, it's like a survival game where it has a lot of click to hold actions. Like if you search a refrigerator, you either click down the mouse button or hold down a particular button, and you have to hold it down for about 3 to 4 seconds. And most of the interactions in the game work like that. Like if you're skinning a deer or pulling back an arrow, most of it's kind of click to hold actions. But if you turn on the accessible interaction option, you actually just press it instead. And that makes the game more accessible to people who have like chronic pain or other conditions that make it difficult to be repeatedly holding down a button for a long amount of time. So with accessibility, again, all this is really still an open conversation. So it's more about best practices than a one-size-fits-all approach. Something that's good is to start thinking about accessible design earlier in your game production schedule, because it's much easier to design something with this in mind than it is to go back and like essentially change the entire design of the game to fit a certain type of design or to be accessible to more players. Like it's possible, but it can be really difficult and resource intensive to have to kind of go back and like patch these things. And another thing is a lot of these things there's kind of like ways to simulate these while you're playtesting. Like what a lot of developers do with color blindness is you can take screenshots of your game and you can upload those to a certain website to see what they would look like through the filter of a certain color blindness. And something other developers do is they actually create the filters in-game as a development tool, and then they go through and play with that filter to kind of see what it would be like for players who have a certain kind of color blindness, and then they tweak certain design decisions based off of that. Simulators are really helpful. Like that can be as simple as turning off the audio to see what playing the game is like for a player who's able to hear the audio. But it's also important to include players with disabilities in whatever your playtesting and QA process looks like. And I know depending on if you work at a studio or if you're an indie, that can look wildly different. But although simulators are helpful, they don't necessarily give you the full picture of what it would be like to play your game for someone who does have a disability. And something else that's really important is implementing accessible design looks different depending on what your field is. Like if you're a graphic designer, if you're user interface, if you're a programmer, if you're a writer, all these things look different. Thinking about how to make it relevant to what you're doing in your specific field is kind of the challenge with this. But because it's kind of an open dialogue right now, it's important to kind of keep listening to the players that this affects and also to keep researching it. And some really good resources I recommend. There's the Game Accessibility Guidelines. That's a website that's not run by any individual studio. It's kind of like a cross-studio effort. It kind of breaks it down by hierarchy, like basic accessibility things, which like some of the things I've covered with color blindness and subtitles. And then it has more advanced things. Like something I'm doing with my game Southern Monsters is the game is fully accessible to players who use screen readers, like low vision or blind players. So the Game Accessibility Guidelines actually does have instructions and examples for games that have successfully accomplished things like that. Another good resource is Ian Hamilton. He is an accessibility advocate who's been talking about this stuff for basically as long as it's been a subject. He runs a really good blog that has a lot of like really helpful articles about the best way to kind of approach the subject and implementing it in your own design. And finally, another resource I really recommend, every year for the past couple of years, there's been the Game Accessibility Conference. All their presentations are uploaded to YouTube for free online, going back as far as the conference started, essentially. And those are like really fantastic to watch as a resource. I will leave that up. But I do have a couple minutes for questions if anyone wants to ask or wants me to expand on anything I've spoken about. Yeah.
You said, especially people with disabilities,
Well, it's hard. Basically, yeah, that's kind of what it involves. If you have the budget for it, it really helps if you can offer payment for people's time. But yeah, what I do, because I work on a lot of indie games, what I do is I ask through my networks. I go on Twitter, I ask. Essentially, I pose it as kind of like an opportunity. I'm upfront about if there's payment or not. I specify how much of their time it would involve, and I specify like the specific mechanic that I need help play testing. So the question is if it would count as volunteer time on the part of the playtester. What I would recommend for that is I would work with the playtester in question to kind of have, thank you, to have, to figure out what kind of credit they would actually want on the game. And also if they're, again, I generally recommend paying people, but I know with certain indie projects that's not always possible, especially with like, short-term playtesters and beta testers. But if they'd like to be credited as a beta tester or a play tester, I definitely think that's good practice. Yes. Mm-hmm. Yes. So what he just said, there's the charity Able Gamers, and they actually do have resources for connecting you with playtesters who have certain disabilities. Thank you for bringing that up. That slipped my mind. It's similar. So the question was, there's certain web standards for web accessibility for disabilities, and they were asking if the game accessibility guidelines is a similar thing. It's different in that this is difficult to phrase. It's more like a resource that it's a little bit difficult to get people to adopt right now, whereas I think there's more pushback if you kind of aren't complying with the web standards for accessibility. Right now, it's more like an informal resource than anything, but hopefully we can get more and more people to adopt it. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Mhm. So the question was if there's a lot of work being done with players who are aging and conditions related to aging and making, I assume, games more accessible to people who are aging. Unfortunately, not a whole lot right now. There are conversations about it. Kind of like I mentioned, a lot of these discussions have only started happening in the past few years. There's a lot of talk about chronic pain and how that affects the experience of playing games. And there's a lot of talk about low vision and other things that kind of, in some cases, come about as a result of age. But I think that's definitely a weak spot right now in the discussion. And I think I have time for one more question. Last one. Yes. Yeah, so the question was, how can you make your games more accessible if you don't necessarily have the resources for things like, thank you, for QA and playtesting? What I suggest in this case is essentially just trying to do a lot of research. Like the game accessibility guidelines is a great start. I do recommend using simulators. Like if you take a screenshot of your game, there are websites where you can upload the screenshot and see what it looks like to a player who has a certain type of color blindness. You can, turn off your audio to kind of simulate what it would be like if you couldn't hear it. There's kind of like a lot of tips and tricks that kind of exist, and it's not a perfect replacement for hiring, players who have those disabilities. But it is a much better step than, of course, not considering this in your design. So I would just kind of recommend like looking at what's out there, kind of starting with these resources. And in a lot of cases, players who have these disabilities publish articles about what it's like, and those can kind of factor into your design as well. Cool. My time is up. I will answer that after. Sorry, Matt. Okay. Yeah, so as Matt pointed out, there are also certain typefaces that are designed for people with certain types of dyslexia that are really good. I recommend those as well. Yep, same thing. Thank you all so much.
It ain't no game, but they saying welcome to the second level.